Hey everybody, thanks for coming. Presentation today is on the promises and pitfalls of Drupal's cache system. My name is Kelly Lucas. I am lead digital architect at Pegasystems. Pegasystems is a software developer based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We build CRM, customer relationship management, BPM, business process management software, to Fortune 500 companies. The Pega platform is actually similar to Drupal in a lot of ways because it's used as sort of a platform to build applications. Yeah, it's good. The Lego metaphor is used very frequently in the Pega world as well as it is in the Drupal world. We use Drupal at Pega for all our most of our public and semi-public facing websites, including Pega.com and Community, which is our developer portal, as well as Academy, which is our training website. And soon we'll be using it for our internal intranet site, which is currently on SharePoint. We'll be moving that to Drupal in 2019. So, quickly what we're going to go over the promises or the features of the Drupal cache system, which includes complete page caching for anonymous users, dynamic page caching for authenticated users, component level caching that helps for both of those scenarios, progressive page loading with Big Pipe, granular invalidation mechanisms, and the strong support for content delivery networks. One thing actually I should have started off with is I just having this conversation with Rob. The more I try to learn about the Drupal cache system, the more I realize how much I don't know about it. I'd ask myself a question and then try to prove it out and realize, oh, but I don't know this or I don't know that. So feel free if you do have experience and have any questions or I say something wrong, raise your hand, let me know. Anonymous page caching is not new to Drupal 8 and Drupal 8. It existed in Drupal 7. I assume most people kind of understand why you want to have caching. It's basically about saving repeated work. If everybody gets the same version of the page, it doesn't make sense for Drupal to do some expensive page building, which includes a lot of database requests and PHP processing if everyone's going to get the same version of the page. But in D7 it was tricky, mostly because dependencies weren't really well mapped out in Drupal 7. So while you could save a node and it would clear the page cache for that node, it didn't necessarily know when you saved a taxonomy term all the pages, all the pieces of cached content that had that taxonomy term on it. So with Drupal 8, there is much better granular invalidation. And when you have a strong anonymous page cache in Drupal, it means you also can have a strong anonymous page cache at the CDN level, the content delivery network level. Now, not that CDN support wasn't possible or is not possible with Drupal 7, it certainly is. But you run into the same problems that you do with Drupal's own page cache, which is how do you invalidate pages that have multiple dependencies. And additionally, and probably most notably with Drupal 7 or Drupal 8, was the addition of the dynamic page cache. And what this allowed is for partial responses for authenticated users to get cached. And then right before sending the page to the user, Drupal can now replace the most dynamic pieces of the page on the fly. So you get the advantage of the dynamic page cache. So let's say the home page has some user-specific content like Hello Kelly on it, but otherwise is the same for most people. The parts of it that are the same for most people can get cached, and then the Hello Kelly business can get replaced right before sending the request down to the browser. So you're really only spending time at that lazy build moment with the stuff that's particular to the particular user. And additionally, while there was a render cache in Drupal 7, I think it was the block cache really, it was expanded significantly in Drupal 8, and the API was enhanced such that any component of a page could be cached at the render array level for your developer. That means that blocks can get cached in the render cache, views can get cached in the render cache, entity views can get cached, media rendering. Now I put a question mark here on this line because I was actually experimenting with this today, and I don't know if actually the render cache is possible for it to contribute, the lazy build can leverage it. The use case for that would be something that's cacheable but expensive to render the first time. And I was experimenting with that. If we have time, I might even show you my experiment. But I couldn't quite see that the lazy build was leveraging the render cache. So the API enhancements that make this possible in Drupal 8 are the addition of cacheability metadata. And there are 3 parts to cacheability metadata. They are context, tags, and max age. So the way the cacheability metadata works is that every sort of renderable component on a page has some cacheability metadata, and it bubbles up to the largest outer part of the page or response. So essentially page 1 here in this example would inherit all the cacheability metadata of the components inside it. So that the metadata, again, is broken up into 3 parts: context, tags, and max age. Context determine variance. So they're saying essentially that if I give this component a context of route, it means that depending on what path or what part of the route I decide to make part of the context, this component will vary by the different path that it appears on in the cache. And then that will bubble up to the page, which essentially means the page will also vary by route. Current user is a very common one. You would say, okay, this component is going to vary by current user. And current user is special because of some things that we'll go over in a second. It won't necessarily bubble up to the page because of some features we'll talk about in a second. Cache tags define dependencies. So those are data dependencies. The most common are dependencies related to specific entities. So what that would say is, okay, if node 1 gets updated or media 5 gets updated, let's invalidate the cache for this whole response, for this whole page. And max age is pretty straightforward. It determines whether, on a sort of a time basis, whether the component is cacheable. Now, typically, context and tags should cover you, but there may be cases where max age makes sense. The most common case would be you'd set it to 0 because it just isn't worth ever caching that component. It just changes too frequently. And greater than 0, so would probably be, I think the best use case I can think of is where the data that that component depends on is stored outside of Drupal's control, and you don't have quite of a sense of how to track its variance. You're grabbing it from a service or a non-Drupal database, so you just decide, okay, well, let's just invalidate every 5 minutes, so it stays somewhat fresh. So I mentioned that the user cache context, at least by default in Drupal, was special. That's because Drupal has support for what's called auto-placeholdering. So to prevent that dynamic page from being infected by the user context and essentially not being cacheable for every user, what Drupal does is it says, okay, there are certain cache contexts, user being one of them, where I'm going to say I'm going to first replace that component with a placeholder, save the response, and then at the very last minute, in that lazy boat step, I'll replace the dynamic bits with the placeholder content. By default, the render strategy that is in Drupal core when you enable the dynamic page cache is called single flush. So with the single flush render strategy, on the first request for a particular page or a particular response, the high cardinality elements, like user recession variant element, are placeholdered, and that response is cached. On subsequent requests, that partial response is retrieved from the cache, and then placeholders are replaced right before sending it the response down to the browser. With Drupal, I believe it was either 8.4, 8.5, Big Pipe module became non-experimental, so it's stable. It's another render strategy, and instead of a single flush, it uses multiple flushes, and it's pretty ingenious the way it works. So just like single flush, you can use a dynamic page cache and auto placeholdering to cache parts of the page. But instead of waiting to placeholder everything and flushing out the response, Big Pipe flushes out that partial response with the placeholders, so the browser actually sees the placeholders. And then subsequent flushes send JavaScript commands to replace those placeholder elements. The one thing that people, I think, get confused by, because it is confusing, is that this is still all happening in a single request for that HTML page. It's just that the web server is sending the response out in chunks. So these JS commands, even though they leverage the AJAX API, they're not actually initiating separate HTTP requests. You can choose to forget about that if that's more confusing than it sounds. So I can quickly demo Big Pipe. So I have a instance of the Umami site running locally here. And I've installed a module called the Big Pipe demo module. I'm going to go ahead and add a block to just the tabs area because it's a bless you. I'm just going to give that ID 1. And actually, I'm going to make one other change. So you'll notice that if I reload the page, that block doesn't display immediately. It comes in later. And that's because, again, we're able to leverage the dynamic page cache to send out the skeleton of the page. And then this special demo block with high cardinality is getting rendered because of a subsequent flush. And if you actually view source, scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see the commands that Big Pipe uses. These are AJAX API commands, but again, they're not actually doing an asynchronous HTTP call. They're just replacing the content on the page right before the server sends the closing body tag.
Do you have Twig debugging turned on?
I do. Would you like me to turn it on? So I'm going to go ahead and disable that block and then move on. I can't disable it from here.
Can you change the region to disable it?
Can
Do you mean to edit the big pipe block?
Did I not? Oh, I clicked the tabs. Well, that's fun too.
Yeah.
Oh, just do it. So I went over that pretty quickly, but those were the promises, or are the promises and the features of the Drupal Way cache system. Again, that's complete page caching for anonymous users, dynamic page caching for authenticated users, component level caching, progressive page load with Big Pipe, and the ability to granularly invalidate parts of the cache because of that sophisticated cacheability metadata. But I'm guessing that the real reason most people are here, not so much to hear about all the features, but the potential pitfalls of the Drupal Way cache system. So I want to caveat this heavily by saying absolutely use the Drupal 8 cache system. Don't not use the Drupal 8 cache system. And I'm certainly in no way criticizing the people that built the Drupal 8 cache system because, like I said, every time I look at it, I'm just amazed and realize how much I don't know about it because it is so complicated, but it does work for the most part very well. But the pitfalls come with customizations to Drupal, custom code to Drupal. That's probably the main one. That's going to be a recurring theme for the rest of the pitfalls. List and newness, automated processes, high miss rates, the fact that you kind of have to know the Drupal way. Big pipe support, we'll go over that a bit. And there are some stuff in core that is not yet supported. So customization, this is probably, if you take away anything, this one example is probably the one thing I'd like people to take away from this. So I'm going to add another block. Actually, I'm going to enable it because I already have baked it. So this is just a custom content block. Again, I added it to the tabs mostly so I wouldn't have to scroll. I'm going to go ahead and edit this block. I'm just going to add some more content. And click Save. Uh-oh. For some reason, new content isn't displaying. Can anyone guess what might be happening?
Cached.
Mm-hmm. But I just said we had granular and cache invalidation mechanisms.
You didn't output the cache metadata in the Twig template.
You're correct. So the use case here, I don't want to edit the note. The use case here is I've added a field to my my custom block type that I don't want displaying on the front end. It's this invisible field. Maybe editors ask for some metadata that they just wanted to have on the back end for tracking this information. Maybe I'm using it in the back end to help sort blocks or something. I'm not sure what the reason is, but all I know is that on the front end, it's not supposed to display. So as a theme developer, I've gone in and I've created a template. Now, I hacked the umami theme, and you wouldn't ever do that. And I've created a Twig override for that block.
Can you zoom in, Kelly?
Sure. Is that better?
Yeah.
And instead of outputting the whole content variable, I'm outputting just the body. The problem with that is that you have to output the whole content variable, or you have to render the whole content variable for those cache tags to bubble up to the components above it. So the fix here, it's a little wonky. Well, there's a couple of fixes actually. One would be to pass the content variable as you're printing it through the without filter and saying without the field you didn't want to display. But if there are a lot of fields that you didn't want to display in this particular template, that would be tedious. The other workaround actually would be to use a display mode. That's probably the Drupal way of doing it. But there is a workaround that is, again, a little wonky, but it does the job. And that's simply to set a variable, a throwaway variable, and let me go back to my slides real quick. Save that, cross my fingers. Now I didn't need to actually output the content. I just needed to trigger a render of the whole content array. And I'm going to go back to the home page for node 7. Just going to refresh the page so that there is a cache generated for the dynamic page cache. Add some more content. Save. And now my block is displaying as I'd expect. So the other pitfall that I've seen with customizations is not being aware of data dependencies, in particular, or context dependencies. So let's say your boss or your client really loves the powered by Drupal block. It's their favorite block. But what they really want to do is they really want to foster a sense of community on your site. So they want to say powered by Drupal and the user's name. That's cool. I know how to do that. So I've created a custom module. I've created a block plugin. It extends block base. It uses dependency injection.
Make it bigger.
It's very small right now.
Thank you.
And I have a build function. It generates some markup. It says powered by Drupal and current user, and I am assigning current user to the current user and their display name. And if we go and we look at user test number 1 right here. Oh, spoiler alert. You'll see that this person sees powered by Drupal and test 1. Cool. If I go back to this page where I'm logged in as admin, I'll refresh and see that I see powered by Drupal and admin. No problem, right? Well, actually, there is a problem. If I happen to log in as a user with the same role as test number 1, and just to prove it, I'll go to this person's page. Their user test 2, I scroll down, and uh-oh, it says powered by Drupal and test 1. Now this is, it may seem like a sort of minor problem, but this is actually could be considered a security issue. This is an information disclosure problem. This means, imagine a site where people are joining and they're discussing their medical problems or any sort of issue where they expect confidentiality. They don't expect anybody to know that they're a member of the site. Displaying their name against, it could be a serious security hole. Luckily, it's fairly easy to address once you're aware that, Drupal cache contexts exist. So what I've done is I've updated the block and I've added a get cache context method, and I'm making sure to add the user cache context. So now that block will vary by each user. Now it'll still get cached. It'll still, it'll get auto-placeholdered. But now if I refresh test 2's page, I should see powered by Drupal and test 2. And if I refresh test 1's page, I should see powered by Drupal and test 1. Did I? Yep. So those two are like the most common snafus I see, but these are very simple examples. I've seen even experienced developers commit these errors. One example recently that came up was we were doing some custom theming on taxonomy terms that were appearing on a page, and so someone had written a preprocessor to extract the taxonomy term out of the node and assign it to a render array, but never ended up bubbling up those cache tags for the taxonomy terms. And then when the taxonomy terms were renamed, our content team was like, what's going on? The old taxonomy names are still appearing on these pages. So now we'll get into some more tricky areas. Oh, before I do, just some custom coding tips. Turn caching on at some point during your development. If you've looked at the settings, the example settings.local for Drupal, it mentions this, that you should be developing with caching turned on. It's tricky, especially when you're theming, though, because you want to see your changes to your Twig templates immediately and things like that. So it's very common for developers to turn it off. Test as different users like we did. Test as users with different roles. And one thing is to turn on cache headers. In your development services YAML, you can, actually I'll just show it. There's a setting to add cacheability metadata information to the response headers. And that's, probably want this bigger. And that's what this does. If you look at probably have to refresh. And if you look at the HTTP headers, we see the Drupal cache tags that are associated with this response, and we see the cache context associated with this response. One thing I do mention on that slide to watch out with is this string on a sophisticated page can get very, very long. And some web servers will have limits on how large HTTP headers can get. For instance, Doxel, until recently, shipped with limits on how large those headers could get, and you would get an inexplicable white screen when that was turned on certain pages.
I've also had troubles on Acquia with cache, with HTTP response headers being too long.
Really?
Yes.
So the way that, so Acquia, Acquia's varnish integration supports expiration by cache tag, and they do that by reading custom response headers that the Acquia purge module, I believe, adds to the response. But what they do is they actually hash those cache tags so that they're each is only like 3 characters long. The Fastly module does something very similar.
Which actually is prone to collisions. We
You-
had that happen.
Really?
Yeah.
Because they do an MD5 hash, but then just take like the first 3 characters of it. Interesting.
I'm fighting something I know it's in the cloud right now.
So one big thing that I think I was only vaguely aware of until recently was the fact that the cache system, I don't want to say it has trouble with lists, but lists are a hard problem to solve. Lists of content, particularly views of content. So for instance, this is an example of a view that's showing the latest content, the latest nodes, 100 through 98. And we had node 101. The problem is it's a really tricky problem to solve on how to when new content is, or how to invalidate the right lists when new content is added or content in the list has potentially changed. The way that Drupal core solves this is every node view, every user view, every taxonomy view, every entity view gets a cache tag of entity type _list. So for instance, node _list, user _list. And then whenever any node gets added or updated, all the views, all the node views, at least by default, get invalidated on your site. So if you're frequently adding new content, editing content, keep in mind that your node views are frequently being invalidated because of this. And the pages on which they live are being invalidated because of this. There's also a core issue that's still active, that because these broad, node lists, which affects a broad number of pieces of cache data, are invalidated frequently, you have the possibility of having database transaction issues, deadlock issues on the cache tags table in the database. And I believe this problem would still affect you even if you're using memcache or Redis as your cache backend, because that cache tags table is typically not put into those backends. So one way to handle this is to install the Views Custom Cache Tags module. And I have a fairly in-depth demo, but I'm a little concerned about time. So I'll just quickly show you what that module does. And when you enable that module, and actually, no, I think I have it right here. No. When you enable that module, it adds a new caching plugin to the Views backend that's called Custom Tag Based. And so if I apply that to this view, I can now add some custom cache tags. This is Recipes Easy, happens to be one that I'm going to add to this one because this is a view of recipes that have the easy difficulty. And so it's not only added that option to the view, it's also pulled out the node list cache tag from that view. So now when a node is updated, that view won't be expired, but you still have to add some custom code to actually expire the view when easy recipes now are added or updated to the system. So I can come back to this and demo how that actually works. Well, let's see. I can at least show you the code. So basically using using a pre-save hook, I check to see whether the node is a type of a recipe, and then I invalidate both based on the difficulty of the node currently and on its original node. That way, if I change the difficulty on a node, it'll invalidate the right views.
Makes sense.
Did I go from start?
There's also a module called handy cache tags that will give you cache tag per bundle, so per content type.
Handy cache tags, right? Because that's the other issue is like it also doesn't respect content types. So if I updated an article, all the views for my recipes would also get invalidated. Handy cache tags.
Yeah.
Cool.
It does the invalidation and the addition of the tags to the node for you, so you just have to wire it into the view.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think I saw in code that there's a to-do, like, in core, that's like, add one for bundle type.
Yeah.
So, it could be tempting when things get complicated to just say, screw it. I don't know what the cache tag should be. I don't know what the cache context should be. I don't want to create a custom cache context. I'm just going to do max age 0. And in fact, that's kind of what the book navigation in core is at right now. I don't want to belittle the people. It's actually, navigation and menus are actually really hard. Benji knows a lot about this. We ran into this on our site because we may be the last company in the world using the book module to display tech docs. And they're coming from an external system, and they have very complex and sizable navigation. And we're taking several seconds. How many seconds, Benji? 20 seconds at least to generate?
20, 30 seconds to generate it, and then 2 to 6 seconds on a reload once it's already cached.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In theory, the right way to create your dynamic content is, well, create your dynamic content. Make sure it has the right cache tags or make some new ones. I Adding number 3 because of an issue that I'll talk about in a second that we ran into that I still don't understand, which is add a lazy builder callback. Drupal's auto placeholdering should make that necessary in most cases, but we had to do it as a workaround with a problem I'll talk about in a second. And 4, you have to make sure that all of that stays intact through iterations on your site, people adding various alters, preprocess hooks, theming, twiggery of all sorts. And it can be a lot to keep up with. So one thing that we ran into was we were injecting for authenticated users into the mobile menu. We were doing some pretty goofy surgery, to be honest. But ultimately what we were doing is we were putting like "Hello Kelly" in the mobile menu if you were logged in. And we were doing that by splicing together the account menu and the main menu because the menu was responsive and went into a hamburger, blah, blah, blah. But what was happening was, for some reason, and I haven't been able to replicate this in Umami, was it was causing the whole page, the whole response to not be cacheable. Auto placeholdering wasn't working. So what we ended up having to do, and that's what this slide is basically that one bad apple, that one weird case was causing none of the pages on the site to participate in the dynamic page cache. What we ended up having to do was add a lazy builder to those render arrays so that they are lazily built. But they already had the user context. And in my experiments in Umami, that was enough of a clue to Drupal to do auto placeholdering and not poison the dynamic page cache or invalidate. It's not really poisoning, but keep the page from participating in it. I don't know why. If I have time, I can show you the code. But I think it had something to do with, again, menus, because menus are weird and complicated. Were
you doing it on just a render array or the render array of a block?
It was just on a render array. I mean,
Did you get the cache key?
The cache key? No, maybe that was it? Wait, well, I'm going to want you to show me what you mean. So one other thing that we ran into this a little bit on our Academy site, at least in initial development, was we're importing nodes from an external system on a regular basis. And originally the importing was pretty just blindly importing everything, or so basically reading the external source, bringing in the data, saving the node. What it wasn't doing was checking to see whether the nodes in the source had actually changed at all. So what was happening was that a lot of useless invalidations were happening. The nodes were being invalidated for no reason. They hadn't changed in the source, so why invalidate them? So we ended up implementing, essentially we ended up calling the migrate process with the -- update flag, which migrate module supports incremental. Basically it hashes the source data, saves that hash, and if that hash hasn't changed, it won't bother updating the destination entity in Drupal. But we also have other mechanisms that import content that don't use the migrate API. And in that case, we implemented basically our own hashing mechanism where we were hashing the source data, saving it to the node, and then the next time we would try to sync that, we would just do a comparison to make sure that that hash had actually changed before trying to save. And that way we weren't invalidating nodes or pages on which the nodes appear for no reason. So one thing that can happen with this render cache is you end up caching a lot. You end up putting a lot of stuff in the cache. And in practice, frequently. A lot of it doesn't ever get reused on other pages. So when Lears, one of the main architects of this whole cache system, even floated the idea of maybe we should just remove render caching. We have the dynamic page cache. We may not be saving ourselves any time by leveraging it to generate those dynamic responses. Maybe we should remove it. Now, there's a fair amount of pushback in the issue, but it was a really interesting issue. But there was a problem in 8.4 where if you weren't using a backend like memcache or Redis for your render cache, aka you're using the database, that database table will just grow infinitely and would never get truncated. So I was talking about this with Rob. I think you might actually know a little bit more about the issue. It sounds like the solution was just basically just to cap the number of rows in the table.
Like get delete above, like you are limited to say 5,000 in that table, delete everything else. And I think there's some logic that orders it by created date, but yeah, it's basically as simple as that.
So one way that you could address that is if you understood what was filling your cache with data that wasn't really ever used or was invalidated more frequently than you would ever use it, you could add a context. This is the default render config that ships with Drupal, but you could add a context to the auto-placeholdering configuration that would prevent that stuff from filling up the render cache. You could also add tags. So let's say, for instance, my custom tag of easy recipes or something was frequently invalidated. They were updated all the time. I could add that tag to this configuration. This goes in your services YAML file. I should have mentioned that. That way, those pieces of content would then participate in auto-placeholdering automatically. But to even understand that, you would need to, well, I'll get to that, but you would need some metrics, right? One other thing I should mention about Big Pipe, I think Big Pipe's really cool. I've given talks on it in the past. You should know that it does have prerequisites. It's not really a pitfall, but you have to be aware of the prerequisites. And it wasn't even until, I think, August that Acquia supported Big Pipe. But your host needs to support output buffering. If you have a CDN, your content delivery network needs to support output buffering. That's the chunking of the response out to the browser. And one thing that we run into, and it's bad Drupal behaviors because the BigPipe API leverages the Ajax API, and it's adding new content to the DOM. It's calling Drupal attached behaviors. And what we found were that some users or some developers were using Drupal behavior basically as an alias for document on ready, which it's not exactly an alias for that. And so multiple behaviors would get attached to the same piece of content erroneously, and it would break things. And, if you know anything about the Drupal JavaScript API and Drupal behaviors, just keep that in mind. The solution there, not to go down a JavaScript rabbit hole, but it's to use something like, well, to scope your behavior according to context, or use the once plugin that ships with Drupal, or check to see whether the current context is the document if all else fails. In doing this presentation, I found that there are some bugs or unsupported bits in core. We talked about the book navigation. I also discovered, as I was playing around with Umami, that the entity breadcrumb doesn't update when the entity title changes. So literally, you're on the edit page for the node, and you update the title, and you save it. The breadcrumb doesn't change on the resulting page. It was weird. So I mentioned metrics. One thing that I haven't been able to find is anything that provides good metrics on your hit ratio or your miss ratio, or what you're actually caching, what you're actually putting into your cache. In the sense that there's nothing in core, and I couldn't even really find any contributed modules that helped with this. So I have right here, this is just a screenshot of what we get from Fastly, which does provide that statistics. Fastly is our CDN. So we do have a sense of at any time what the hit ratio is, and we have a lot of logging that goes into, we have Sumo logic as a logging backend, so that we could do reports on more granular reports. This is kind of just an overview. There was a D7 module called Cache that provided at least an API for logging information about cache misses and cache hits, but it hasn't been ported to Drupal 8, and I think that's one thing I would like to work on if I give this presentation again, is a POC of that Cache module.
So that should say D8, no D8 port?
That is correct. So I want to leave time for questions and discussion, but if we have time, I do have some demos of the list stuff. In conclusion, definitely use caching. Again, don't go in and turn off the dynamic page cache, which is turned on by default in the standard Drupal profiles now. But keep in mind that it's complicated. As I hopefully have demonstrated, I don't even understand very parts of it. Tuning takes work and maintenance. In particular, again, tuning for lists that's going to be an ongoing issue. So you add new content types, you add new views, you would in theory be wanting to add new caching and validation mechanisms for those lists to really take advantage of the Drupal 8 cache layer. So with that, I will be posting the slides. I have resources here. The docs on the Cache API are pretty good. But they sort of hover at an overview level, and if you start really asking questions, they don't answer the questions, nor should they be. Wim Leers, again, one of the main architects of this system, his blog is a great resource for learning about the Drupal 8 cache system. And then a couple of blog posts that were really, and sessions for past DrupalCons that were really helpful for me. So are there any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're using a web application firewall like Capsule or Cloudflare or something like that that also has CDN capabilities, is this really compatible with that? If you're turning on, they have dynamic caching, they have all kinds of different methods, but
yeah, so
does it really communicate, right?
So that's a great question. I think to summarize the question was how what's the Drupal 8 caching? How does it work with? You mentioned a web application firewall with CDN capabilities. Yeah. So I do have a little bit of experience with Cloudflare, and I have most experience with Fastly, and so Fastly provides our content delivery network and our web application firewall, and it works really well with the Fastly module and the purge module, such that it worked the page caching piece, the granular invalidation, works really well. Works just like it does with Drupal's internal page cache, more or less. But that may be because Fastly is basically distributed Varnish. It's basically hosted Varnish across the world with nodes across the world. I'm not as familiar with, I think you mentioned some CDNs. I know Akamai has something called dynamic caching. I'm not sure what Cloudflare's is, where you can just turn something on at the CDN level and it kind of will detect whether your pages are dynamic or not. And that has its own algorithms. I don't know how that works, but do you have something?
So I'm dealing with something right now with Cloudflare, using the Purger module in Authwea Cloud.
Which module is that?
I think it's just called Cloudflare.
Are you saying purge module? Is that what you
Yeah, it's like Cloudflare Purge or something like that. So we're using Authwea. Authwea Purge obviously has a dependency on Purge and Cloudflare. So Cloudflare is sitting there as the application firewall, CDN, and using page cache as well as Varnish, and then Drupal page cache. So I didn't build this, I'm walking into this, too many caching layers right now. The problem is that we're having is none of the pages are actually clearing cache. And the reason why that is, I literally discovered the other day, is in the, they're using the purger queue to asynchronously clear these cache tags. Cloudflare has an API limit for the amount of cache tags that you can clear in a 24-hour cycle. Because this site has so much content, if they were to update one piece of content, that's probably clearing hundreds of cache tags because of lists and whatnot. They're hitting their API limits within the first hour of the day.
Wow.
So they actually haven't been able to clear cache since April 8th of this year. There is over 400,000 cache tags sitting in the purger table. And my recommendation is to just shut off Cloudflare page caching because there's no way that they can actually, they can't invalidate their cache. So what's happening is they're hitting that 2,000 limit, which it's 2,000 requests per cache tag at a maximum of 30 cache tags a day. So it's 60,000 requests. They're hitting up in an hour because it's just, it's clearing it. The second issue of that is they have it set up where this is purging every 10 seconds through cron. So because the way the purger module works, if one of the purgers fails, it doesn't actually clear out of the table. So cache just never clears out of Drupal whatsoever. So they have to do a manual cache in Drupal, manual cache in Varnish, and manual cache clear in Cloudflare. So my recommendation was actually Fastly, because in Acquia Cloud's support documents, it does say that there's just a hard limit, and if you have a lot of content, it's just kind of what it is.
Does Acquia's, did you run into limits at Acquia's Varnish layer too?
No, I just started working on this project, and I haven't gotten to that point. The recommendation that I just gave was let's shut off Cloudflare and see what happens with Varnish and Acquia Cloud. But that's kind of the only warning I think I have for anybody with this experience is if you have a lot of content and you're trying to use Cloudflare for page cache, it just won't work with Drupal.
Yeah, wow, and that's because Acquia actually white labels Cloudflare as Acquia Edge.
Yeah. So we did talk to Acquia about that issue, Acquia and Cloudflare, and they said that, I don't know if this is case specific, but they have some flexibility on those API limits and that they may be able to raise them.
Okay.
So they want to reach out to them.
I think that was also our next step. I think the immediate fix is to just shut it off for now and then reevaluate. How many cache tags are we actually clearing in a 24-hour period, and then go to Cloudflare and say, hey, we need this many requests. Because I guess going to Cloudflare without any metrics in this case, it would just be kind of like throwing something against the wall and see if it sticks.
Yep. Yeah, we've been through 3 CDNs since I've been at Pega. We started with Cloudflare, aka Acquia Edge. We didn't run into that issue. One issue we did run into it was that configuration was not. Basically, the issue was that anonymous users their browser was caching a page, and then when they would log in and then go back to that page, they were seeing the anonymous page that their browser had cached. And so what I wanted to do was to tweak the headers that got sent back to the browser, make them different than the headers that were sent to Cloudflare in their responses, and I never really got it to work, so we ended up just having to turn off page caching because stakeholders were like, I'm still seeing, it says I'm not logged in, I just logged in. It was madhouse. We then went to Akamai. But when we moved to Drupal 8, Akamai didn't have any support for cache tags at the time. Really? Rob says they still don't. And so Fastly was actually recommended to me by WinLears. And again, Fastly is really just hosted Varnish. So if you have BCL chops, I think Fastly is a real good choice for content delivery network.
On the technical level, what you're looking for out of a CDN that will integrate well with Drupal is something called surrogate key or cache tags. So Fastly calls it cache tags.
No, I think they call it surrogate keys.
Key. Cloudflare calls it cache tags.
Yeah. And Acquia calls them something else. Cache tags?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm going to get your information because I think there's a pitfall I can add to the slides. And my contact information will be on there. If anybody else runs into pitfalls, I'd love more fodder for this talk.